Shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Well, I am joined today by some good friends, Gabe, Rench, Nate, Wright. Thank you guys both so much for coming back on repeat guests on Eschatology Matters.
Thanks for having us. This is a Fight Laugh Feast network show, basically.
That is true.
Right?
Yeah.
You know
Brandon
what I'm
did
saying?
remind me to remind our viewers this is some of our Fight Laugh Feast cohorts. So yeah, thank you guys for coming on, and Nate joining us all the way from Canada. So thanks, brother.
The soon to be 51st state is that the
Let's not stir those waters. We're talking about other stuff. We'll stir that
Yeah.
pot another time.
I will say though, like you guys are two of my favorite Americans. So this is like the two of my favorite Americans, Gabe Rench and Mr. Josh Howard. So it's good to
Much
be with you guys.
appreciated. Much appreciated, brother. Yeah, you're one of like 5 Canadian people I know in general, so it'd
So
be
one
kind
of
a
your
condescending
favorite
thing to
also.
say. Yeah,
Yes, yeah. The pool is small, but yes, Nate.
that's right. That's right.
Appreciate it.
You
I always feel
graduated
like
top
Canada-
5 in the class.
Yeah, I always feel like Canada is like one of those places where you say, I'm from Arkansas, and somebody's like, "Oh, do you know Jimmy?" Like he's from Arkansas too. I feel like Canada like almost falls into that category, but
Totally.
probably
Yeah.
lost. Yeah,
People
whatever
always
Canadian
ask
viewers we
me.
have.
Yeah, literally when we were in Kentucky for the Fight Laugh Feast conference 2 years ago, we had people oh, do you know? And I'm like, I know we're small. Like I do know 35 million's a lot less than 350 million, but like it's still a lot of people. I don't know them all.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've at least gotten past the hockey games where we're all slugging it out with your boys, but yeah, we've moved past that and gone on to different types of slugging in the streets of America, which we might get to here in a minute. But Gabe, you guys have a conference coming up. You guys are talking about something that doesn't influence or impact probably anybody that watches our channel. That's tongue in cheek, right? This is kind of at the heart of it. Tell us a little bit about FLF conference, but also what's the theme you guys are tackling this year and why?
Yeah, so we started our tagline in our show became Fight Laugh Feast over the years, actually pretty quickly. Fight Laugh Feast because we thought Christians need to fight well with each other and against the world and sin, that Christians should laugh well. The joy of the Lord is our strength. We should be jolly warriors and feasting. God prepared a table in the presence of David's enemies. Like the feasting is key to building community within your house, building community within your city and within your church, and also fighting at the gates of God's enemies. God prepares a table in the presence of David's enemies. So Fight Laugh Feast became kind of a tagline that really took off. And so we decided to call our conference Fight Laugh Feast Conference, which we started in 2020. And basically, I think what we do is we create conferences that are pretty angular in the sense that the topics are very, most conferences might have to do with, let's say, the holiness of God or worship or something along those kind of theological lines, which of course that's great. I don't disagree with the holiness of God theology. But to me, conferences kind of became a place where it was just everyone patting each other on the back and rehashing old topics that have already been kind of figured out. The Puritans figured out a lot of this for us, and so our conferences became really important to, I think, framing out for us what Christians need to be thinking about given our time, our current culture, the current problems that are. So we did a conference on politics of sex. We did a conference on politics of six-day creation. We did, so we largely try to connect what we're doing and the topics we're talking about to what's happening in the streets right now. Politics of sex, transgenderism, all that stuff is still big. But we also kind of, with that comes some problems. You got to answer a lot of questions. What do you mean politics of sex? Can my 8-year-old come to your conference? It's like, yes. Do they read Samson? Yes, then they can come. And so this year the topic is school wars. Obviously having a little fun with Star Wars there. School wars, how to rebuild Christendom with your kids. And this topic, obviously it spans so many issues, discipleship, discipling your kids in your own house, public education, university education, How does the church think about discipleship? How does, dad think about, discipling his employees? It crosses. It's not just about, going to school every day. And if we think about um, America, and when Constitution was ratified, 99% of the U.S. population was Protestant, not even Catholic, not even, EO, whatever. 99% was Protestant. And that was, 1787, 1789. And so what's happened in America and the moral decay that's happened in America, to me, is 100% the fault of the Protestant church. If we dominated America back in, 1780, then what's happened is the only way you lose America if you dominate America and the culture and its population is you don't keep your kids.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what happened is the Protestant Christian church over time lost their kids over time to, unbelief, to other sects, whatever. And that's been devastating. I mean, we should basically, the way God talks about God keeps, in some sense, faithfulness obviously is by the grace of God. We're saved by grace through faith, but in some sense related to that, because God promises that if you're faithful to me, I'll bless you to 1,000 years. So at some point, Protestants in America let unfaithfulness creep into their churches through feminism, through, elders or pastors being pastors who should step down for not having faithful kids or cheating on their wife, whatever. Over time, and I can map this out even through the public education system, over time, America lost their children and unfaithfulness came in and we lost America. I'm in a town of, and I'll stop here, but I live in Moscow, Idaho, and my Pastor Doug, has been pastoring since 77, 78. I don't even know. So he's been here for, almost 50 years pastoring. And we're in a town of about 20,000 people, give or take when the students come in. And what I've seen, we're about 4 generations into the work here in Moscow. And Moscow is a University of Idaho here. It's a liberal town, college town, surrounded by farm fields. And that's it. So you got these conservative farmers around, but you got the towns owned by liberals because of the University of Idaho. And it takes about 3,500 votes to get a mayor. What I'm illustrating is what faithfulness should look like and how God makes it easy for Christians to take over their city, makes it easy for Christians to take back America. That's what I'm illustrating right here. And it takes about 3,500 votes to get a mayor. And we got 20,000 people here. Let's say the voting population is something like 11,000, and the voting population 10,000 because you got kids and stuff that can't vote yet, age stuff, requirements, all that jazz. Well, in my churches, so Pastor Wilson started Christ Church, and then we started another church called Trinity Reform, and then we planted another church called King's Cross. I'm at King's Cross with Pastor Toby. Pastor Toby teaches at King's Cross. We are about 2,000 people between all of our churches here in town now. So we now make up about 10% of Moscow. And what's happening is you just have just average families growing their kids to love the Lord, and we're slowly taking over Moscow. And I think in 10 to 20 years, we'll take over the politics of Moscow. Because our kids will vote. Our kids are staying. Our kids aren't leaving. It's our kids. We aren't aborting our children. We aren't, it's cool to stay with your mom and dad here in town. Whereas the liberals, it's not cool. Kids like, I don't want to stay with my mom and dad in town. I'm going to go to college in Boise. I'm going to go to college in Seattle, whatever. So just the culture of what's happening is just like faithfulness over time wins. And so that's, I taking a long way to illustrate, that's why school wars is so important. Because how you disciple your kids matters to 1,000 generations. It doesn't just matter for them getting a job or for them, in the next 10 years or whatever. It matters the way God puts it. It matters to 1,000 generations. And so look what's in it. Whatever happens in the house eventually happens in the streets. This is why homosexuality is a sin in the house, just as much as a sin out in the streets. This is why, we have riots in our houses. We don't have faithful family culture in the house. We have riots in our house. We're fighting, we're bickering and everything. So we get riots out in the street. Mm-hmm. Like it's all connected. And this is why it's so important to think of discipleship not just as education. Obviously, that's an emphasis at our conference, but you have to think about discipleship in a post-mill eschatological way to 1,000 generations. I've talked a lot, and I'll just kind of I just wanted to set up like how important it is to think. Don't just think about discipleship as education. Think about discipleship as it matters everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Nate, I know you've probably got thoughts on this. There's a couple of things that Gabe was touching on that I'd love to talk about, obviously, but this being a focus for Christians, I think it's overdue, and I think it's catching on. So you brought up at least one of the things you were bringing up, Gabe, is just kind of like you said, it's not like a myopic focus on just education, like you put them in the right school and it checks out, but it is kind of like at the heart of it is where are your kids going to, where are they being educated? What does their schooling look like? Not just formal education, but I'm assuming you're talking about kind of formative education as well. But when you look at those things, I was thinking of, we've been digging into a little bit of this, like in our church and with our families. And Machen back in the day, he had a quote, and it was something along the lines of that he saw little or he saw no consistency with a Christianity that preaches the gospel to the farthest reaches of the world and on every street corner. I'm butchering the quote, but something along those lines. He said, but abandons the children of the covenant to a cold and unbelieving secularism. Of course, Machen, he wrote that decades back, right? But that's kind of been
So good.
a lot of Christians' experience is that we have been. I'm thinking of me. I grew up, I was an early 80s baby, and I know you guys are right in that same kind of milieu. And, growing up, I remember evangelism hot. Missions, especially foreign missions, forefront.
Yeah.
And praise God for those things. Nothing wrong with it. But as far as like the children of the church, they're pretty noisy and they stink, and they probably, get them over here to the side. So I think it's a retrieval process that's long overdue.
Yeah.
But Nate, what are you thinking, man?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think God's pattern is pretty clear, scripturally speaking, that like family is at the center of God's rescue plan for the world, and the church is the household of households, right? So you have a church is only as strong as the households that comprise it, as the families that make it up. It's the family of families, the household of households, and then you have as goes the family, so goes the church. As it goes the church, so goes the community. As goes the community, so goes the nations, right? So you have this sort of working through, and I think you spot on, Josh. Like I think the sexy things that churches have been so enamored with big conferences and overseas missions and all this kind of stuff at the expense of our own families has been a travesty. And I think that you can't export what you don't have. And so you have these churches that get all wound up and send all these foreign missionaries off, and yet even in the commissioning services of these new missionaries, the kids are downstairs in the dank basement being taught by a 60-year-old woman using a flannel graph. And like
Don't knock flannel graph. That's not the culprit, but go ahead.
You leave flannel graphs out of this.
Yeah, that's right. But you know what I mean? Like we haven't developed family culture in our churches, and so the kinds of missions that we're exporting is a weak family church. Yeah. And so like we're exporting then to other cultures a weak form of Christianity. And you even see this, like, I don't want to knock anybody who's done a lot for the kingdom, but when you think of sort of that Billy Graham crusade style of whether it's revival meetings, evangelism, whether it's missions, whatever, it's this sort of parachute in, decisionism, and then, there's no discipleship. And well, why is that our form of ministry? That's our form of ministry because that's all we know in our families, right? We haven't discipled our kids well enough. And I think, one of the things that we've really emphasized at our church, in our, like we switched to family integrated church, like keeping the kids in the worship service, foregoing the Sunday school and the nursery and all that kind of stuff years ago now. And it was a big transition for our church. I was convinced of it long before we made that transition, and we kind of did it slowly and loved our people along the way. So a lot of people who come and they hear good things about our church and they come and then they're like what's going on here? Like where's
the kids?
Yeah, where's your nursery? Where's the kids ministry? Yeah. And then we emphasize to them like, no, this is your chance you are forming and shaping the next generation of worshipers. what you do see for the people who stick around, because sometimes they they come once and then they go
Yeah.
for the sweet, kids ministry down the street. But when they stick around and you get fathers who understand, oh, it's my job to listen to my pastor, disseminate the information, and actually disciple my children with it. And so we're going home and having conversations. It honors the way God did these families. So it just changes ministry. And I just think because we haven't got it right in our churches, we haven't got it right, or we haven't got it right in our families, we haven't got it right in our churches, this is why. And we were joking before the camera started rolling here is that you guys have riots in LA, from a bunch of kids who should have got spanked when they were younger and probably
Yeah.
might not be rioting if they'd gotten spanked a little bit. You know what I mean? Like
That's
it
right.
all comes down to family discipleship.
That's right.
And I think like when people do come to our church and we have like church family worship guides and stuff like that, like I think one of the things that you know just family worship is such a foreign concept. Like how
Yeah.
is it you want to ask like how do we lose Canada? How do we lose America in,
Mm,
less than a century? It's because nobody was doing family worship. So I
mm,
think all of this is connected, and I think this
mm,
is the crux. If you want to get to like what's the bedrock issue that makes like we can talk about transgenderism, we can talk about riots in the street, we can talk about all the stuff going
hmm.
on. It all comes down to this.
I
It
I
all comes
I,
from
I like how you're kind of keying in on. Well, you mentioned a second ago, like, we don't know how to do missions. We don't know how to do church planting because we're not exactly doing it at home. And there was an old quote, and I can't remember who it came from. I think it might have come from somebody I don't particularly like following anymore, but he brought up, it was a good point. He said, you don't become a missionary on the plane, something along those lines. And
Mm.
essentially, like, you've got these young people who are very, they're filled with passion and whatever, and they say, I'm going to go on the mission field and I'm going to become a missionary. And he'd say, who have you shared with this week? Because you don't become, a missionary on the plane ride. I think we're seeing that within church culture. We're saying,
Yeah.
go and worship together, and people don't know how to do it. And then we ask them, like, well, what do you do at home? And it's like, well, we don't do any of this stuff at home. And it's kind of the crux. Now, Gabe, you said something a minute ago, and I'll kick it back to you, but you said something a minute ago that I thought was interesting. So if you look back, there's a lot of things that I think American Christians, we look back, 100 years, like Nate just brought up, and we look back and we're kind of shocked by things. I live outside of Pittsburgh, and so I was just hearing, I think it was Timon Klein talking this morning, and talking about some of the framers, right around the time of the framing of the Constitution, and specifically with like the First Amendment and all of the things that kind of flowed from it. Around the time of that framing and sussing out of those constitutional details, Pennsylvania's requirement for elected officials was that they not only affirm Old and New Testament, but affirm them as
Yeah.
inspired.
Yeah.
Like American Christians look back and like, what in
Hmm.
Pennsylvania, and that's religious freedom. So we've just kind of lost some of that connection. Now, along those lines, I think Christians in churches would be shocked to hear what so many Christians 100 years and then further back said about the family. Stuff like Charles Hodge, for example, is one of my favorites on this, and he spoke about the family in ways that would make us really uncomfortable because he used ecclesiastical terms. And he's talking about the father as a sort of minister or vicar to his children, and that he raises, in essence, a small Shiloh within his home that is then to lift up praise to the Lord. And when the father fails in this regard to lead his children and family into worship, he's in essence beckoning in demons that will inhabit the premises. Like, you read the stuff and you're like, this is so foreign from our conception. Our conception is, I did my job. I woke them up. I made sure their teeth were brushed, and I gave them to
Hmm.
Lucy, the third grade teacher, and I'll see them when we get out of church. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like we've
Yeah.
just lost the plot on that. But what are you thinking on some of that stuff, Gabe?
Well, I think there's, uh, I mean, well, let me start here. There are any cultural sin that we have in our that are a major cultural sin in our current moment started in the church. So to Nate's point, like what happens in the family affects the church. What happens in the church affects culture. The church, God created the church to be a city on a hill, a light on that hill, and which means that the church is where the Christian faith is strong in a culture. The church is explicitly connected to the sins of the culture. So where the church has most influence in a culture, like in America, it doesn't have a lot of influence, right now in Congo. So where the church has a high concentration of impact it's going to be connected to the sins of America. And so think about it this way. Feminism started in the church in the early 1800s. It started where women in the church, I'm sure their husbands were drunks or whatever, but started getting pastors to sign abstinent vows and getting the congregation to sign abstinent vows to not drink alcohol. And that was the process in which wine got kicked out of the church to celebrate the Lord's Supper, and how grape juice got instituted in the church. Over early 1800s, I wrote an article about this 2 years ago on my website. And then by the 1860s, all these abstinent vows were being signed, and they started realizing, well, we got to fix our wine problem, our alcohol problem. And so Pastor Welch came along and figured out how to strip alcohol out of grape juice. And in fact, there's a market for it. But it started because of women, and then the women got the pastors to push abstinent vows in the church, and then along came Ed Welch, and then now this happens in the PCA, this happens in the Baptist churches, and now you have this weird theology that was constructed off of old feminism on a defense of why we serve grape juice in the Lord's Supper in the church. It came from first wave feminism, which is hilarious. And I'm not saying we serve wine in our communion trays, and we have some grape juice in the back for people who need it. We understand that it's more complicated than that. But that was a feminist theology that affected and created, and now all these pastors have this new construct or this new theology on how to defend grape juice in the Lord's Supper, but it came from the 1800s. Secondly, another example of this, and this is where I tend to get most in trouble with this argument, talking about sins happened in the church first, and then they showed up in culture later and worse. Abortion. To Nate's point, we, for decades, maybe a century, I don't know when the practice even started. Maybe it was Finney, I don't know. But we started separating family from kids and worship. Mm-hmm. And so you'd walk in the church, mom and dad would go upstairs to real church, and the kids knew it. That's serious church. That's where you really talk to God. And we're going to go down in the basement and play church and do felt boards or whatever, flannel boards, whatever. We're going to go. And what happened is the kids over time is communicating. They got the communication. We aren't as important to go to the real worship service. And so multiple things happen there. One is you start creating two different kind of churches, because there's one kind of music downstairs, one kind of music upstairs, one kind of pastoring upstairs, one kind of pastoring downstairs. So you actually end up creating two different churches, which has had massive damage in the church. I'm not going to talk about that right now. But the other thing is it aborted families from worshiping together. And so the church taught the world that that children were not that important when it came to the family's relationship to God. The church taught the world that children were not as important. They were not as valuable. They were not, so we taught the world how to abort your kids out of worship first. And so no wonder the world comes along. I know you're thinking it's a big jump, but no wonder the world comes along and aborts the kids out of the wombs.
So I hear the typical Christian hearing what you were saying, especially about you come to church and you go to, they used to call it big church, right? In our areas, you go to big church upstairs, the kids go to little church or kids church or whatever. And they would see that well, what's the problem? They're still hearing about Jesus. They're still hearing about these things. I think what we reduce to a lot of times is what you were aiming at earlier, Gabe, when you were introducing this topic, is that families aren't just real important because they make more people. That's good. Families aren't just important because you're probably going to teach your kids how to read or help teach them how to read. If you happen to send them to school or something, there's these little accidental functions of the family, but at the core of it, it's actually the building block of how God made everything. So they're the actual building blocks of society, of culture, of the world, and God made that covenantally so, not accidentally so. God actually said, this is the way I'm going to form this thing. That used to be very just recognized covenantal Christian thinking. Yeah. And we've so divorced ourselves from that when we look at the family, you bringing up the riots sounds very strange, because it's whoa, those are political issues, socio-cultural issues. And I'm not acting like it's just a simplistic matter. Obviously, there's different things going on there, but at the core of it is the family always is the family issue at the core of these things, because from that is birthed the rest of human culture and society. So if there are errors, and Gabe, this goes to your point, if there are errors, whether it be something that does not seem to match up, you might throw feminism out there and somebody says, whoa, that's a mismatch. Everything is traceable back to the home and the hearth, because of how God formed culture and civilization. That's right. And I just don't think most Christians are even seeing that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to bring up an argument that we disagree on. All I'm trying to illustrate is that there's like what your point is there's so much we're doing in the church to either separate our kids from the family or separate our kids from the faith or separate and disciple our kids in such a way where it's like it's so easy for them to leave the church and go out into the world because we've forgotten what true discipleship should look like with our children.
Right.
You know, and I could punch the Baptists in the face too with this, where it's like sometimes there's certain circles where
They've had a
Baptists
rough
don't
week. They just had their convention.
they
Gabe.
did.
Don't go
They did.
punching the Baptists, okay? Give them a break.
Well, most of our Baptist friends would probably agree on this point. There's a lot of Baptist culture where they won't let their kids get baptized until they're 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, really late. Most of our Baptist friends, they're like, oh yeah, profession of faith at 8 years old, I'm on it, you know. But this is an extreme example, but it's pretty prevalent in the broader, you know, Jeffries, Rick Warren, even our friend
Nine Marks.
Nine Marks, yeah, where they want to make sure their kid is such a solid Christian before they baptize them, whatever that means. And they won't let them baptize. So they want to check all the boxes. So it's like 17, 18 years old. And so, well, again, the same description kind of applies. Well, what if your kid goes to church and worships with you for 17 years? And they look down the row and they say, why am I not baptized, mom and dad? Is because mom and dad doesn't think they're a Christian. That's what that's basically what's driving it is mom and dad doesn't think I'm a Christian yet. So you teach your kids to doubt their faith for 17 years. Well, you're going to get a bunch of doubting children leave your church.
Yeah.
So they get baptized, but by the time they're 17, that seed of doubt has been sitting there for 17 years. And so that's no wonder why the rebaptism rates high in those circles and those cultures because they've been teaching. But so just an example of like this is how we're thinking in the church. We're aborting our kids from worship service. It's no wonder we're eventually going to get to the point where we abort our kids from mother's wombs because we already showed the world how to think about your kids.
Well, and to that point, Gabe, you talked about like instilling doubt in your kids. And what it's doing is it's actually discipling them in a hermeneutic of doubt, right? To constantly be looking inward, examining, am I really in? Do I really belong to God? Does God really love me? Does he really exist? And they take that hermeneutic of doubt that's been discipled into them. And when they go out into the world with it, you know, the world is happy to feed that doubt, right? So you've instilled the hermeneutic of doubt. Then they go out and they're like, well, it seems also kind of strange that a donkey would talk, and it seems pretty strange when God would stop the sun in the sky. And you know, my science teacher has a different view on that, and maybe Yom could mean a million years. And so, but it's because they have been discipled with a hermeneutic of doubt, and that started in the family. And I think, like to your point, where you're talking about like abortion starting with the devaluing of kids within the church. I think this gets Pastor Doug is fond on saying I'm going through Rushdoony with a few guys that I'm training in pastoral ministry right now, where he got the idea of the inescapable concept. So the church is for the discipleship of the nations. That's inescapable, and we will either disciple them well or we will disciple them poorly. But either way, they're going to get their cues from the church. And the church is the household of households. So what happens in the family will affect the culture. It's just a matter of whether it affects it positively or negatively. And I think if we're all looking around at what's going on in the world around us, it's a bad report card. Clearly we're not doing this well.
Yeah, whether you agree with my examples or not, the one thing that's super clear is we are not being successful keeping our kids in the church. This is why you have what I call like a Starbucks church model. And the churches know it, that they have to be so seeker friendly. They have to keep replacing the congregation. They have to keep replacing who they're serving because the door
Otherwise,
in
they
and
all
out
get
the
old
church.
and die.
Well, they can't keep their kids. That's what
I mean. They just get old and die because their kids don't stick around.
That's right. And so you see this huge seeker friendly movement. I mean, now they're integrating Starbucks literally into their church. But Starbucks is not the best coffee, but the way they keep their customers through their marketing. And so, they have a high turnover of customer rate. I haven't drank at Starbucks for years. And same way the church, they have to, because they can't keep their kids, because they can't even keep their families in their pews longer than 3 or 4 or 5 years, they have to recycle and do a good job with their marketing to keep their church size up.
Yeah. So what are the solutions then that you point to? Because I know you're coming in, you're talking about building Christendom with your kids. Obviously, like the school function is at the heart of it. Um, and we do want to land the plane at some point, but I'm just thinking like maybe
Yeah.
Gabe, if you could like key in on
Yeah.
maybe that formative function of the school,
Hmm.
because I think one of the things, you brought up at the beginning, it's more than just school. But it's not less than school. That's obviously a huge part of this.
Yeah.
Just looking at the hours. I mean, you've seen those graphs that break down hours that your kids will spend here or there. In fact, I just read one and it was talking about how your kid, it was like by the time they're 17, they've spent like 85% of their time with their parents that they will. And I've got a daughter who's creeping up toward that age, and it was like, ugh, I want to go around the corner now. But this is a huge responsibility, right, with school.
Yeah.
How does that sort of integrate in, and how do we maybe encourage parents? And you guys are familiar with these struggles. Some Christian parents who find their kids in private Christian schools, some who
Hmm.
are able to or feel equipped to homeschool their kids. Others who
Yeah.
have not made those choices. There's a lot of mix within churches. So like, how do you start? At least starting that process of encouraging Christian parents among a large swath of different Christian groups to start thinking toward their kids with that school function involved with building
Yeah.
Christendom. How do you angle toward that?
Yeah. I would start with, I mean, dad is responsible for the education of his kids.
That's a great starting point.
Not the wife is his helper. The wife is his helpmeet. But dad should not throw the responsibility off to his wife. That'll create so many problems. Whether it's homeschool, hey, honey, it's your decision. You want to homeschool or do you want some Christian school, whatever.
Yeah.
No, dad has to take the lead on this because he's going to have to take the financial hit if he's going to pay for classical Christian school. His wife's going to have to take the homeschool hit, and he's got to make sure he's going alongside with her to make sure that hit is falls more on him as best he can than on her. Um, and so I was reading this table talk. Oh man, on 2003 or something, a long time ago. And there's this quote that, you know, um, men want to go and slay dragons, but no one wants to help mom change the diapers. And what that illustrates, especially for men, is that we prioritize. So men prioritize. We're very monolithic in a lot of our thinking process. I'm going to do this. I'm going to my office to study. I'm going here. I'm gonna, I now got to go to baseball. So we're one thought wonders all over the place. But what that shows is that dad wants to go slay dragons, which is a good desire. We don't want to crush that desire. But the problem is the best way to slay dragons is actually change your kids' diapers. You
Right.
is actually bring up reinforcements to go out and fight with you. And but we dads have lost I think the long-term vision of how
Yeah.
important it is to raise their kids and be the leader in raising their kids.
Yeah.
This goes back to y'all's point about ministry. I mean, like what became sexy ministry was missions, church planning, Acts 29, like all these things. But the hardest ministry you'll ever do is raising kids past 22.
Yeah.
Like not just 17, not just 18, but being with your kids and launching them and then becoming friends, becoming side by side with them. That's the hardest ministry. That's the hardest launch, but it's also the most fruitful thing you ever do. So I think dads need to recover the glory of what it means to raise faithful children in the family. That's where I start first. I mean, as far as like, obviously, you got to be wise and smart. What's good for my family? What can my wife handle? What can I handle? How much money do I have? Can I, then you got to start running the inventory of what I can handle. How good am I at education? Can I do homeschool? Can I pay for a classical Christian school? And not all Christian schools are Christian schools. So you got to have wisdom there and sort through all that. But I think dads got to think way bigger than we have been about raising our kids and our family.
And where you started there, Gabe, and Josh even kind of gave the amen for both of us there in terms of that's a great starting point is, dads need to take responsibility. It's dad's job to educate the kids. That seems controversial in a lot of ways, and I think in a lot of church communities, because a lot of church communities where homeschooling is big and all that kind of stuff, it's like, well, that's her thing, right? That's mom's thing, that's her calling, right? But nobody, well, no proper Christian would view discipleship in the home as mom's responsibility, right? That's clearly dad's responsibility. And what we've lost is the link between education and discipleship. All education is
Mhm.
discipleship, right? Jesus
That's
says,
right.
a student when fully trained will be like his teacher. And that's just
Mhm.
that's another inescapable concept. So a student will become like their teacher for better or for worse. And so when the father gets the vision that education is discipleship, then
Mhm.
that okay, are you responsible for the discipleship in your home? Yes. Then you're responsible for the education in your home. Now, just like any other responsibility that husbands have, like we can wisely delegate certain aspects of our responsibility, like you said, to classic Christian school or whatever. But I think if we
Mhm.
get piece first, discipleship is our responsibility and education is discipleship, then
Yeah.
that's a big piece. And I think that you talked about that. I remember Doug Wilson one time. I think it was on the podcast maybe or something, but it was an analogy that always stuck with me when he said, if you ask the guy mopping the deck on the submarine what he's doing, his answer ought to be, "I'm fighting in a war." Because he
Yeah.
understands, like whether
Right.
you are turning the
Right.
torpedo in the submarine, or
Mhm.
you're mopping the deck, or you're making the pizza in the cantina or
Mhm.
whatever, you're
Mhm.
fighting a war. You're just doing your part for it. So that connection with dragon slaying and diaper changing
Yeah.
it's a
That's great.
mental paradigm
Yep.
shift that every father needs to have. And so you want to conquer the world, that's a good ambition, but you have to start by taking dominion of your home. And that means not having riotous children, right? Having disciplined children who are
Yeah.
being raised in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So I think that's right, is connecting the big things that men are passionate about, that every man has the desire to pull up his sword and go and fight a
Mhm.
dragon, but recognizing that this is really where it starts.
Yeah, I like that.
Mhm.
And I like the encouraging thought just for Christian dads. And it's not just for it's for Christian parents, I think mainly. Although, if I could back up, I could preach a whole sermon right about now on how it's not just for the young couple having kids. Like if you're an 80-year-old in the church whose kids are all grown up, this is still
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
responsibility. Because if
That's right.
everything we've been talking about is true, and this is how God's formed the universe is on these families, you should be actively involved with helping families. But topic for
Totally.
another day probably. But when I
Yeah.
was hearing you talk just then, like especially with like the inescapable, you will raise your children, depends on how well you will do. Same with nations, like was brought up. One of the things that Carl Truman brought up in that the what was the Rise and
Rise
Triumph,
and
Rise
fall.
and yeah, whatever the
Yeah,
book was,
rise and
right?
triumph for the American.
He talked about poiesis, mimesis, this whole, it's a old Greek antiquity idea, but essentially of how to look at the universe and whether this is something moldable, malleable, that everything around me is something I form to my desires, or is there sort of a structure and grid work for most of these things, and I'm to align myself to it. And I bring that up not to just bring up a nerdy concept. I think that's one of the things you have to get through to Christian parents and to Christians in general who are wrestling with this is your job and role in parenting and in the home. Like this isn't something that you decide how it can work. This is
Yeah.
something you need to recognize. Like I, as a father, really have things God needs me to do for my family, and He has designed me and equipped me for. You can't just say like, well, in my home it works a bit different. My wife fills these roles and I do these other things. Um, in broad brushstrokes, you have a role to do, and you're to conform yourself to the way God's economy has actually shaped and formed these things. I think that alone is just a helpful thing for Christians to understand that the family's going to function in this role, whether you want it to or not. So our task then is to disciple it effectively and faithfully, and yeah, just from that, like you were saying, to rebuild Christendom from those foundations. But Gabe, where can people keep up with the conference? You mentioned
Yeah.
your blog. Do you remember the title of
Mhm.
that article, by the way? Just any of those plugs you can give.
I had to write that article. Again, I'm sorry I used that example that we disagree with on. I should have brought up a better example that I knew we'd all agree on. My fault.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to, because I know we weren't debating that. So my bad for that. But if you want to catch the blog post, it's actually in response to, I tweeted out, it, probably wasn't the best tweet, but that's back when you had 140 characters. I tweeted something out like, if you're taking grape juice in your church during communion, you're being influenced by feminism or something like that. I said something like that, and probably said it worse than that.
Standard
But
tweet. Yeah, standard Twitter
yeah,
fare
yeah,
right
yeah.
there.
So Tom Askell got a little frustrated with me. Some other good guys I love got a little frustrated with me. So I wrote a whole blog post just tracing the history of first wave feminism in the early 1801, 1802 is when this whole thing started. And there's about 3 or 4 or 5 women that kind of picked up the mantle each decade, and was basically it was started over alcohol, and where the women were influencing the pastors and everything. And then Ed Welch came in the 1850s, 60s to, so that's the context of my article. And it's go to GabeRench.com, and I think you click on vault or articles or something, and you should be able to find that article. So it was actually, I was trying to make some things right that I made wrong by just being such a short, insulting tweet to how some other people had taken it. So
Again, that's standard Twitter. That is all of Twitter, in fact.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the whole thing.
yeah. So there's go to GabeRench.com for that article. I think it's worth reading. Of course, I'm arguing from a Paedo communion standpoint in that article, but I think just even the nature of the influence of first wave feminism on the church and theology and wine and grape juice and everything, I think it's worth a read. The conference, you can go to fightlaughfeast.com. And you can click on, sign up, or you can click on be a sponsor. Everything. It's October 16th through the 18th. In Nashville, Tennessee. We got, of course, Pastor Wilson, Dr. Ben Merkel from New St. Andrews College. We got, I guess I can announce this here. We got Larry Taunton coming on. If you guys know who Larry is, he's a kind of a journalist, kind of subversive journalist. That he's in the PCA down in Alabama. His home got swatted a couple months ago. Just crazy. But he's speaking. We got David Goodwin from ACCS. We got David Bonson. We got George Grant. Just a bunch of players who've been in this kind of world for 30, 40 years, and have raised faithful children. That's the other thing. I just want to maybe end with one point here too, Josh, where I was saying that God made discipleship easier. God made taking over the world easy. The non-unbelievers abort their children, or have one kid, or have 2 kids, and just over time they just aren't reproducing what they need to keep up with their side of the culture. And so if the church just gets discipleship right and raise their kids faithfully, over time it just becomes a numbers game eventually. I know it's all by grace, God's kind, it's by faith, all that stuff, but in one sense, God, he says, I'll bless you to 1,000 generations. And so in one sense, it is a numbers game. And so I just want parents to think way bigger about discipleship than just going, what school should they go to? What homeschool should they do? What homeschool curriculum should they do? Should we do classical conversations? It matters to the church. It matters to the world. It matters to the kingdom, and how you disciple your kids at every level, including your wife, including yourself, including the church, including the elders, and all that stuff. So go to fightlaughfeast.com to sign up, and love to see you guys there. We start off our conference with beer and psalms. It's a fun way to kick off the conference. Good fellowship. We do Cross Politics does a live show on Saturday afternoon, so a fun way to end everything. It's just and please bring your kids. We actually have a jumpy castle for kids. We have ways for kids to, when they get a little excited, they need to go outside and jump on the castle. We have all that stuff. So we're very kid friendly in what we do and everything. So fightlaughfeast.com.
Very cool. Free baptisms for all the kids too. Nate, where can people keep up with you, brother? You're busier than a one-armed wallpaper hanger, as they'd say down south up there in Canada these days, brother. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, it's lots of work to do up here. So you could go to crossroadsingersoll.ca. So we're trying our best to do a faithful kind of Moscow blueprint out here. Ingersoll's a little town outside of London, Ontario, just a couple hours north of Detroit. 30,000 people, and we're trying to take it over slowly. So crossroadsingersoll.ca. Also EzraInstitute.com. I'm also the Canadian director of the Ezra Institute, so I work alongside Joe Boot, who's a friend of Fight Laugh Feast as well. We have the podcast for Cultural Reformation on the Fight Laugh Feast network. So EzraInstitute.com, you can find a lot of my lectures and conference talks and all that kind of stuff there. Nate P. Wright on Twitter, and I say less controversial things than Gabe, but I do get into trouble every once in a while.
That's what Twitter's for, man. That's the whole kit and caboodle. And the Rebel podcast still, right?
Yeah, Rebel podcast with Fight Laugh Feast, and I'm actually I'm helping a couple guys in my church get another podcast project off the ground called Reforming Nerddom, which has been a lot of fun.
Yep.
So the idea there is that you want to take all things and put them under the feet of Jesus in victory. So what things in nerd culture should be put under the feet of Jesus in victory? So we talk everything from, nostalgic things like we got Jeff Durbin coming on to talk about Ninja Turtles. We had we have Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney coming on to debate whether or not Narnia or the Ransom trilogy is the best C.S. Lewis
Yes.
fantasy.
Yes.
Just cool stuff
I'm
like
here for
that.
that one.
Talking about that kind of stuff, and I think we're trying to organize Brian Sauvé and Joshua Hames coming on to debate whether or not anime is cringe. So like just fun stuff like that. Like
That's great. That's
it's
great.
kind of a cool, yeah, and like analyzing movies from a Christian worldview. I'll just say this because it kind of plugs into our discussion today. Is one of my favorite games to play with my family is whether we're watching a movie or we're playing a board game or listening to a song or something like that. We play a game called Spot the Lie. And so, in the middle of a movie, I'll press pause and it's kind of like worldview analysis of the movie that we're watching right now. All my kids love it, obviously, when I just pause the movie and get into deep theological conversations with them. But you're trying to teach them. So we do that on the show. We do Spot the Lie, and we'll go watch the new Marvel movie, and then we'll play Spot the Lie and help kind of give parents like a worldview analysis of movies that they can help disciple their kids while they're engaged in like superhero movies or nerdy stuff like that. So anyway, that's Reforming Nerddom, and you can find that on social media somewhere too. So yeah, do lots of stuff.
Somewhere out there. Very cool. Well, Nate, Gabe, thank you guys so much. This has been encouraging. Appreciate you guys.
Josh, thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command.